the previous lecture, I referred to Kant as a Shiva figure of the Enlightenment, like the Hindu god Shiva, whose dance brought an end to one cosmic epoch and gave rise to another one. Kant brought to an end and completed, in a way, one cosmic epoch in the modern era of intellectual thought, and in a way created a new one. In the last lecture, we looked at the sense in which he was something of a completer of Enlightenment ideals, but also a destroyer of them by undermining the Enlightenment faith in reason and science. In this lecture, we want to look a little further at Kant's later works, in which he tried to reconstruct things again when he became, if you will, a creator of a new intellectual order. If he had stopped with the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant's contribution to the ancient quest for wisdom would have been wholly negative, and many of his contemporaries, in fact, took it to be so. But Kant himself wanted to go on further and discuss the questions of metaphysics and ethics and values and other things that matter to most people. If these questions of metaphysics or philosophy could not be answered and accessed by science or theoretical reason, then perhaps he thought they could be accessed in another way, by practical reason, that is, reasoning about how we live and how we act. By such an indirect route through practical reason, Kant also thought that perhaps he could vindicate some of the great ideals of the Enlightenment, like the dignity of the individual or the universal rights to life and liberty and so on, which he himself so admired and cared about. If reason and science couldn't vindicate these, theoretical reason that is, then perhaps through practical reasoning, the way we think about our everyday life, we could find some access to them. So echoing in a way what he had learned at his mother's knee about the things worthy of admiration, the starry heavens above us and the moral law within us, science told us about the starry heavens above us, but if we were going to understand the great questions of life, we would have to look at the other side of those two things, namely the moral law within us. That's where Kant thought we ought to begin in our thinking about the great questions of metaphysics and philosophy. If we could show, for example, that through practical reasoning we had to suppose a moral law and some kind of morality, and also a free will by which we could act morally or not morally, then we might have reason to believe these things even if science could not prove them to us. In that way, we might vindicate some of the Enlightenment ideals about human beings, and we might also get some clues, Kant thought, to some of the great questions about the human soul and God and our ultimate destiny. Such was Kant's project in his ethical works after the Critique of Pure Reason, works like the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals and the Critique of Practical Reason. Now, to access these questions through practical reason, however, Kant thought we had to get beyond our individual desires and purposes. We had, so to speak, to expand our vision beyond our narrow selfish interests to other things, beyond our own limited perspective. Practical reason is concerned with how we ought to live. But the concern, he thought, could not merely be about our own particular everyday interests. It could not be a matter of how we ought to live if we wanted or desired this or that particular thing, because human beings have different desires and purposes. We do not all desire the same things, and that wouldn't give us the desired universality of perspective that metaphysical and philosophical questions require. Kant expressed this important point in the following way. He said most of our everyday concerns, when we reason practically, have to do with what he called hypothetical imperatives or oughts, what we ought to do. In other words, oughts that have an if in them. If you want to stay healthy, you ought to eat right and exercise. If you want others to trust you, you ought to tell the truth. We tell our children these practical maxims. If you want to become a doctor or a lawyer, you ought to study, and so on. Everyday life is made up of these things. Practical reasoning and practical life have these hypothetical oughts all the time. Nowadays, they can get pretty confusing. We're told for a time you couldn't eat chocolate, and now it appears that chocolate has antioxidants in it, which are very, very good for you. I've got friends eating all the chocolate they can until the next study comes along telling them that it's no good for you again. Now, these hypothetical imperatives, though they're the stuff of everyday life, apply only to those who happen to have the particular wants or desires in question. And the desires of people may differ and even possibly be evil. If you want to be a good terrorist, you ought to learn how to make bombs is just as good a hypothetical imperative if it's true, as any other one. So for Kant, by contrast, ethics or morality can't be represented by these hypothetical imperatives alone. They are more practical than they are ethical or moral, because they have an if in them in this way. It is what we want for ethics is some idea of duty. That is, what everyone ought to do, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, no matter what your particular purposes or desires. This would be the universality he wants. And he calls such imperatives categorical imperatives to distinguish them from hypothetical ones. For instance, a categorical imperative would say, don't lie, period. No ifs, ands, and buts. It wouldn't say, don't lie if you want to be trusted by others. That would be a practical, everyday kind of imperative. But rather, categorically, don't lie, it's wrong. That, Kant says, is what our idea of duty is all about. It's about categorical claims of this kind. And such an imperative would be universal or absolute. It would apply to everyone, no matter what their particular desires or purposes, because there's no if in it, not don't do this if you want this. There's no if in it at all, so it will apply to everybody, no matter what their particular desires or purposes, and without qualification. So far, so good. That's what we're looking for when we want to ground morality or ethics on new foundations. But what Kant asks could motivate us to adopt such a categorical imperative, since doing so can't depend on any of our desires or purposes or our individual needs or wants. What could a law be like that had no reference whatever to desires of this kind, or indeed to the consequences? Since a categorical imperative would say something is right or wrong, no matter what consequences it might lead to, it's right or wrong in itself. Kant was looking for something like, in ethics, the thing in itself, what's right or wrong in itself, as in his discussion of science, he was looking for things in themselves, if you will. And Kant's answer to this question, what this law could possibly be based on, this categorical imperative, is given here in his own words, and I quote, "Since I have robbed the will of every inducement that might arise as a consequence of obeying any particular desire or purpose, nothing is left to ground this imperative, this categorical imperative, but the conformity of actions to universal law as such. And this alone must serve the will as its principle. That is to say, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim or ought should become a universal law. That is a law for everyone to follow." In other words, if you want to get beyond your own personal or selfish desires, you should be legislating, you should think of yourself as legislating action for everyone. Then it would be universal, the law you came up with, not just for yourself. Well, this yields Kant's famous categorical imperative. Quote, "Act only on that maxim through which you can will at the same time that it should become a universal law." Unquote. That is a law for everyone to follow, not just yourself. Now, you may feel you have missed a little bit here of how Kant got to this very famous imperative. And if so, join the club. Philosophers have pondered this argument for the categorical imperative, perhaps more than any other in modern ethics. And they disagree about what it is. We need some way of understanding it here, and I want to suggest some clues to you as to how we might go about doing that. First of all, Kant is well aware that in the past, most people have grounded ethics or morality upon the authoritative commands of God or religion of some kind. That's where most of us have learned our morality and our ideas about ethics from our religious training in one form or another. Kant knows that full well. That's where he learned it. But as a true representative of the Enlightenment, he no longer believed that morality could be based on mere external authority. We noted that in the last lecture. That is, it could not be based on what he called heteronomy, law from somebody else or some other thing. Since we had to choose in our own self the basis of our own reason, which authority to accept, and whether to accept any authority at all. And this would be true of our belief in morality or our belief in God. It had to have its source in our own autonomous reason. as Kant put it. Think for yourself, as you recall, was the motto of the Enlightenment, as he had put it. And since there was no scientific proof or theoretical proof of these matters about God and morality, we had to fall back on our practical reason for clues. How to proceed, therefore? Well, here is my attempt to explain a little bit about what Kant is doing in reasoning to his categorical imperative. When we exercise our practical reason, Kant is saying, we're legislating for ourselves. We're acting as self-legislators, if you will. We're giving oughts or laws to ourselves, to put it that way. And in most everyday cases, we legislate ourselves hypothetically. If you want this, or you have this purpose, to lose weight, to become a doctor, then you ought to do such and such. But that's not quite complete self-legislation as Kant understands it, because we're acting merely hypothetically and we're acting for ourselves. But suppose we wanted to legislate universally the right thing to do for all persons or groups. Suppose we wanted to expand our vision, so to speak, so we could see some way of legislating morality or ways of living that went beyond our own personal or subjective or relative ways of doing it, to get some universal or necessary truths about what was good or right for everyone. Now, to do this, Kant is suggesting we'd have to be willing to rise above all of our particular desires and purposes, our selfish ways of life. And we have to be willing to legislate universally for everyone, not just hypothetically for ourselves. We would have to be willing to become something like a universal judge, a King Solomon, so to speak, willing to put aside our selfish desires and purposes in order to wisely legislate for all. We would then have to adopt principles of action that could apply to all of us, and not just to ourselves. But this amounts to Kant's categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim through which you can will that it become a universal law for everyone to follow, not just yourself. We have to do, in other words, let's think of it this way. We have to think here of Kant in the realm of morality and practical reasoning, projecting ourselves beyond our own narrow and limited visions of the world, of our society, of our culture, of our personal tastes, in order to find something universal in the realm of values or ethics. This is not unlike what one does in science, where one, in order to find out what's objectively and universally true about the physical universe, one has to overcome one's own limited vision, one's own biases, and somehow or other find and legislate, or at least discover, some laws that apply to all. Well, Kant is suggesting that we do the same thing here with regard to values and ethics. If we are similarly in need of overcoming narrowness of vision by expanding our vision, don't just legislate selfishly for yourself, try to legislate for everybody, and then you will come up with laws that apply to everyone. In science, overcome your biases, your narrowness of vision. Try to think in terms of views of the world that aren't just something of your own perspective, but cover everyone. So there's a parallelism of how he thinks we should do this in practical reasoning as in theoretical reasoning. Now, of course, Kant emphasizes that only rational beings can do this, imaginatively place themselves above their own particular desires and purposes, and so rise above their physical and biological being. Only by the exercise of human reason can we attain such an objective, and thereby separate ourselves from the beasts. Putting it this way, I think we can see that Kant has an interesting idea here about how to find universal truths in the realm of practical reason, in the realm of values and ethics, and so on. A brilliant idea, in a way. But does it ultimately work? Well, to decide, I think we have to look more closely at the categorical imperative at which he arrived and ask questions about it, what it means and how it's supposed to work. That's what philosophers have done after Kant with his categorical imperative. In a way, Kant helps us out here, because luckily he himself used several famous examples to try to explain to us how this self-legislation, universal legislation, this categorical imperative we're supposed to impose on all, how it would work. By discussing a few of these examples, I think, we can take a look not only at how the categorical imperative works and what it's supposed to mean, but also how other people have tried to criticize it and what kinds of problems might be involved in it. Consider one of Kant's very famous examples. It's about promising. Kant, like others of us brought up in the Judeo-Christian tradition, are told that it is wrong to tell a lie or to break a promise. So breaking promises is wrong. And Kant says, why is it wrong? Let's apply the categorical imperative to it. Suppose I were to make a maxim or an art that I wanted to be universally followed of the form, I will make a promise in this case without intending to keep it. And now Kant said if you tried to universalize that, if you told people they always ought to act in such a way as that when they made promises they would not intend to keep them, you tried to universalize that maxim so everybody acted that way. If you became a legislator for the world, if you will, then the very notion of promise breaking would break down. Because if everyone made promises without intending to keep them, they really wouldn't be making any promises. To make a promise without intending to keep it, after all, is not to make a promise at all. And someone would accuse you of just such. You mean you didn't intend to keep this when you made it? Well, then you really didn't promise. And if that were the case, if you will, that maxim would undermine the very idea of promising and the ways of life that are based on promise-keeping and promises as well. Now, you might think that Kant is reasoning here like this. Gee, if everybody decided, if you made a law that everyone would break their promises, it would be a pretty awful world to live in. You couldn't trust anybody. The consequences would be horrible. And so universalizing it for everybody would be disastrous. And that's why it's wrong. Well, Kant isn't quite reasoning that way because he wants to show not that breaking promises would have terrible consequences, which it might, but then again, it might not. He wants to try to show that breaking promises is wrong in itself. So he's got to say something more than that the consequences would be awful. You see, if we bring in consequences, someone might be willing to say, well, I wouldn't mind living in a world in which everyone tended to break their promises and you couldn't trust people, and I'm willing to take the consequences of doing so. I mean, I agree, it might be a nasty world for some, but I'm a nasty guy, and I'd thrive pretty well. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because I'm the meanest SOB in the valley. Someone might very be willing to universalize such a maxim. It's pretty horrible, have horrible consequences. Indeed, you could think of a criminal syndicate principle. If somebody informs on us, we'll kill them. And if I inform on somebody else, I expect to be killed. Well, you can universalize that. You can suppose everyone to do it in some way or another. So there's something problematic here in Kant's idea about just universalizing. You can apparently universalize too much. It's not picking out just the right things, if you will. Now, Kant wants to avoid such reactions, so his argument rather is that this business about promising, there is a direct contradiction. It's not that the consequences would be bad if everyone broke their promises. It's rather that there is a direct contradiction in the idea of making a promise and not intending to keep it. It's as if the thing goes against practical reason. It's like a contradiction. It's like saying something is both round and square. In theoretical reasoning, this is like a practical contradiction where you promise and yet at the same time you don't undertake it, which means you undermine the very idea of promise altogether. It's something like Groucho Marx. You remember him saying, I wouldn't belong to any club that would have me as a member. A practical inconsistency. I prefer Yogi Berra's version of this, where he says, nobody goes to that nightclub anymore. It's too crowded. So there are various ways to understand, in a certain sense, these practical contradictions. It's where you say something that actually undermines what you are trying to say practically. But now, if we look at Kant's claim that a maxim like this is actually some kind of self-contradiction of reason, so that if anybody tried to break their promises or thought breaking promises could be universalized as a law for everyone, that somehow they were being irrational. They were making a mistake, like saying something was both round and square. Well, it looks like Kant's reasoning here is a little less secure, because that's a very strong claim. People began to ask, is Kant perhaps begging the question here about just what is rational? A cheater or a liar who breaks promises or lies, these people may be evil, they may be wrong, but are they being irrational? Are they making some kind of logical error here? That seems to be what Kant is saying. Or how about persons who prepare to act morally towards those in their own group or class or race or society, but not to those people outside of their class? Their maxim would be, I will keep my promises and not tell lies to those in my own group, to my friends, to my own race, to my own country, people there, but not to outsiders or strangers. The odd thing about this is that that's a universalizable maxim. Of course, it would lead you not to trust strangers, but you could be willing to put up with that. Now, of course, Kant rules out all these things. He doesn't want to believe in them, but it's not clear that his categorical imperative does, in fact, rule them out. Consider another one of his examples about suicide, for example. Kant thinks suicide is always wrong. Again, an inheritance of his Judeo-Christian culture here. But the question is, and the way he tries to eliminate it by his categorical imperative, he says, there's some kind of contradiction involved in the following. We all have a concern for ourselves, and the suicide is saying, in effect, out of concern for myself, I will take away my own life. And Kant thinks that's an inconsistency of practical reason. Out of a concern for my very self, I would be willing to kill myself. And he thinks, therefore, that's a maxim that sort of undercuts itself in the way that the one about promising did. But this is very puzzling indeed, because in some cultures, of course, suicide is regarded as okay. Suicide is regarded as a situation in which sometimes it may be required of me to kill myself, say in Japanese culture, if to do otherwise would bring dishonor on myself and my family and my ancestors and so on. There's no inconsistency, it seems, in universalizing the maxim that persons can commit suicide, if you will, in cases where not to do so would bring dishonor on themselves or on their family and their country. And hence this kind of variability seems to be allowed by Kant's imperative. Thus, the first formulation of Kant's imperative, to act only on those maxims which you could universalize and make universal laws for everyone to follow, seems to be subject to certain criticisms. Most philosophers, I think, have thought that to be the case since Kant wrote. Hegel, one of his chief critics, had said that Kant's formalism, his imperative, is therefore an empty formalism, as Hegel said, in the sense that it seems to not rule out enough. It seems to let too many things in, some of them very bad, such as we have seen, and it seems to rule out some things that seem to be all right. Suicide, let us say, in some cultures. Now, modern Kantians have tried to revise Kant, to amend him or reinterpret him to make up for these problems. Indeed, there are many modern Kantians who think that there are perhaps some limitations in Kant's view here, but they think his view is still very productive and important. Kant is still, his ethics is very influential in modern philosophy, and various people try to defend various parts of it, if not all of it. Now, one way to try to overcome these difficulties is suggested by Kant himself. He offers us a second version of his categorical imperative, which is regarded by many philosophers as more productive. This second version of the imperative, Kant calls his principle of humanity, and you have probably heard it yourself. It goes like this: act so that you always use humanity, in your own person as well as in the person of every other, never merely as a means to your ends, but always at the same time as an end in itself. You use someone as a means to your ends when you subordinate their purposes to yours. You lie to them, you cheat them, you harm them in some way for your own selfish purposes. By contrast, to respect them as ends is to respect their purposes as just as worthy of being realized and not trampled on as your own. Now, Kant claims this principle of humanity is the same principle as his first as the first formulation of his categorical imperative. But most philosophers have thought that's far from obvious. They're related, of course, and it's interesting to see how they're related. Remember, in order to know what's universally the right thing to do for all persons, Kant says we have to be willing to arise above our individual desires and purposes and legislate universally for everyone. Now, the second version of the imperative comes about when we reflect on the very fact that we can be such universal legislators. We can rise above our own personal perspective and desires and actually think about everyone and legislate for everyone. This capacity is our human reason, which places us above the beasts and non-rational beings who can't do that. And it's this very capacity, Kant thinks, that gives us our dignity and our moral worth as persons. And it's that moral worth as persons that needs to be respected according to the second formulation. So the capacity of universal self-legislation, which gives us our dignity in this sense, is the idea of the second formulation. And this capacity Kant associates with our autonomy or free will, for he reasons that as long as we're moved by desires and purposes, then nature, which nature, after all, has given us, we are like non-rational beings, like the beasts who are moved by their instincts and their desires all the time, and therefore are determined by the laws of nature, by instincts and desires and passions. It's only when we use our reason to act on universal principles, we rise above those desires, not just on desire and instinct, that we become truly free and autonomous agents. We rise above nature's laws. That's why he thinks science can't really explain free will, because it involves rising above our desires and our instincts, and therefore above nature's laws altogether, into a noumenal world beyond the merely phenomenal world. So this second version of the categorical imperative, then, follows from the thought that since this freedom of autonomy is what gives us dignity and worth and places us above the beasts and above nature, we should respect what gives us worth, and we should respect anyone who has a similar rational capacity. And Kant finally relates this second version of the categorical imperative, the principle of humanity and the respect due to every human being, to a third principle. We should act toward all other rational beings as if we were all members of what he calls a kingdom of ends, whose free actions and choices are worth respecting. We have that moral worth and dignity by just the fact that we can rise above our own personal interests and consider others. In some ways, these second and third related versions of the categorical imperative seem less abstract and formal, and they do escape some of the criticisms of Kant's first version of his imperative, which has said to have been an empty formalism. But they don't escape all of the problems. For example, there is still a difficulty in the second formulation, the principle of humanity, that has to do, and has often been noted by many philosophers, has to do with the following question. Why should we go from respecting our own freedom and autonomy, which surely we should, to respecting everyone else's freedom and autonomy, which is what the second formulation of the categorical imperative says, that we should respect everybody's freedom and autonomy? Kant does not quite entirely well explain this leap. He does argue that only if we act by the moral law, and we're really free and autonomous, then only if we act by the moral law are we really free and autonomous, because only then do we rise above our particular desires, feelings, and instincts which nature has given us. And so we rise above nature. But is this so? Can we be free only when we act by the moral law? Well, some critics like Nietzsche have said no, we can be free when we have self-mastery, but not always when we're good. So these are some of the ethical debates that have ensued concerning Kant's ethical theory in the 2 centuries after his work. Kant did hope here, however, to explain many other things this way. He thought he had established the moral law and free will, and he thought that if we had the moral law and free will, that we might have to bring in God here to guarantee its efficacy and its significance as well, and perhaps a belief in the immortal soul. These things could not be explained by science, but he thought by practical reason we had to presuppose them And that's what he tried to do. Thank you.